All right, yeah. So thanks you guys for joining us tonight. I'm excited to see such a large group online. We knew that this subject was one that a lot of our coaches were looking for because it came up in the feedback when we traveled around the province of Nova Scotia in September and asked coaches topics that they felt they needed assistance on, and we were talking to community coaches, and a whole lot of people came back with athlete anxiety. And then further to that, when we keep asking in different sessions that we're running, it's a topic that comes up often. So I'm glad to see the large participation online. It's obviously a topic that the group wanted. So thanks you guys for joining us. We have a lot of people who haven't joined on one of our webinars before. So just to give a little background, my name's Natasha Johnson. For those of you I haven't met, I'm the coaching lead with the Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic. So I work to help coaching across all of Atlantic Canada, try to improve our performance coaches, but also reach down and offer opportunities to coaches at any level. So we've started doing these monthly online webinars. They're free. You get PD points for attending tonight. And like I said, they're once a month. When you're looking for them and you're from one of our other provinces, because I'm happy to say we have people online right now from New Brunswick and Newfoundland, they're always listed under Nova Scotia, and that's just because that's the only place I can get them in the locker. You have to choose a host province, so that's why that's done that way. I'm very excited to welcome Danielle tonight. So Danielle works with me at the Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic in Halifax. She's been involved with us for a number of years, kind of left the country for a few years and came back recently, but we're really happy to have her back. She's a mental performance consultant with us. She's worked with teams that I've been involved with over like a long time now before she went away, and then since she's been back, and is just a great person to have in our office. So she's spoken to my athletes on this topic. It was a long time ago now, surrounding kind of injury anxiety. So I'm excited to hear her presentation tonight. I'm going to turn it over to her. And just before I do, because we have a large group online tonight, we are going to keep all of the mics muted. So what that means is any questions, there's a chat, which most of you already found, which is awesome. So use the chat to everyone for questions. You can use the private one if you don't want us to know who's asking the question, or you'd like us to bring it up anonymously. That's fine. If not, just type it in there, and either Danielle or I will pause and answer the questions. You can also use the raise hand icon. We get a notification when your hand is raised, so you could use that icon as well. And then if you have a long question, just let us know in the chat, and we can manually unmute your mic. So we can go that way, but otherwise we'll keep all mics muted to try and keep down on background noise. All right, so Danielle, take it away.
Okay, thanks so much, Natasha. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining in tonight. This is actually my first webinar that I've presented in. I've attended a couple of webinars, but never presented. So this was somewhat performance anxiety for me as well, not knowing what it was going to be like. I'd heard that I'm to expect to talk to myself for about an hour. So if I'm talking too fast, if there's something that you'd like me to go back and speak more towards, please feel free to post messages in the chat. I'll be asking, because my presentations, I'm so used to being interactive. I don't like talking at people. I like trying to get people engaged and asking questions and contributing as well. So I've taken out some of that, but I've left some of it in because I think it's still really important. So just like Natasha said, that there'll be sometimes that I'll be asking some questions. Feel free to answer via chat, and if it's something that requires more of a longer answer, please feel free to message to unmute your microphone, and we can hear directly from you. So As Natasha said, this seems to be a hot topic, which is really exciting. I love talking about this. I love working on this. I love working on it with athletes. And I think a huge component of it is working on it with coaches. I've worked with coaches on an individual basis, and I've worked with parents as well on this topic. So it's nice to see such a large group of coaches be really interested in it and take the time to learn. So, what we'll be talking about today, if I can get that first slide moving. Let's see, just 1 second. Okay, there we go. So today's outline. We're going to talk about what is anxiety. So we'll start with what is general anxiety and differentiate from state and trait and performance anxiety. And we'll get into what causes anxiety and what our stress response is. And then we'll take a brief look at what we'd like to see. So what our ideal performance state is, or what our athlete's ideal performance state is. And then we'll get into what induces anxiety in our athletes and sometimes in ourselves, and how to recognize it. And then finally, how to help your athletes reduce their anxiety. So I wanted to start off with a bit of a story. I don't know if any of you recognize this individual, but this is Alex No Big Deal Honnold. And he is one of the most well-known free climbers in the world. And he obviously has no anxiety or no fear in climbing extremely high mountains, and what they found is that a part of his brain actually inhibits fear in his response. But on the other hand, he has an extreme fear of public speaking. And it has taken him about 10 years through developing different skills to come out and be able to speak publicly. And it just goes to show that each of us have different fears that cause anxiety, and it's all on an individual basis, and it's all what we perceive. So what is anxiety? Well, it's a general term that we use for nervousness, fear, apprehension, and worrying. So feelings, basically. So this anxiety affects how we feel, or anxiety is how we feel, and it affects how we behave, and it can cause physical symptoms. So one of the things that I struggle with sometimes and get questions a lot about is the difference kind of between stress, anxiety, and nervousness, because they're all somewhat used interchangeably. Which is fine, but here I'd like to distinguish both stress and anxiety, because stress is more of our response. It's more of our physiological response when a person perceives that their demands exceed their resources. And it's really important that you focus there on the word perceives, because quite often it's not the case. Whereas anxiety is the reaction to the stress. Stress can come from any situation or even thought that makes one feel frustrated, angry, nervous, or anxious. And just like we saw with Alex Honnold, what is stressful to one person is not necessarily stressful to another. So when talking about reducing anxiety in our athletes, I wanted, even in the title, to kind of specify that we're talking about performance anxiety, because it would be a lot harder to try to reduce trait anxiety versus state anxiety in our athletes. The difference being state anxiety is more of a temporary condition in response to some perceived threat. So we still get those unpleasant feelings when we feel demand or when we're confronted with a specific situation, and it's still our mental assessment of some type of threat. And it's still our perception when something is threatening. And when that threatening situation or thing goes away, usually so does that anxiety. On the other hand, trait anxiety is something that differs in both intensity, duration, and the range of situations in which it occurs. So trait anxiety is more of a personality characteristic. We see this with people that deal with anxiety on a regular basis and not just in specific situations. However, we find athletes or individuals in general with high trait anxiety that they also show higher levels or higher intensity of state anxiety. In addition, they become anxious to a broader range of situations and things. So furthermore, performance anxiety is just kind of a subtype of state anxiety. Basically, it can be sport specific. We see it in acting, we see it in public speaking. And basically it's a decrease with regards to sport, a decrease in athletic performance, or it can be decrease in performance due to too much perceived stress. And the perceived stress often increases on competition day. This is due to three things. One, they have an audience. And in working with so many athletes, it's interesting that athletes always think that everybody, including their competitors, everyone is watching them. And quite often that isn't the case. So they have an audience, and usually the athletes think everyone is watching them. They have high expectations of their success. And sometimes those expectations are pretty ingrained in their belief, and they're not just thoughts. They're something that they have created over time, and with that time, it's become an ingrained belief. Finally, they also have in their heads, or they perceive others to have high expectations of their success. And this typically is coaches and parents or family members. So what happens in these situations? We perceive a situation to be threatening, or we perceive pressure, and we go through the human stress response, which is known as the fight or flight response. And the fight or flight response is something we see in all animals. And what happens is that when there's perceived threat or an actual threat, our body gets ready to either fight or take off. And it's basically a response, a physiological response, to get our bodies to react to those situations. So we typically see sweating, increased heart rate, shallow breathing, sometimes nausea. And so this is basically adrenaline being released into our body to get ready for one of those two things. The thing about the stress response is that it differs based on what we're perceiving and on our individual differences. We often see physical differences in our athletes, and quite often we see psychological or mental differences in our athletes as well. It's important to think about the impact of those differences on perceived stress. So the environment in which they live, their previous sporting events or experiences, and their genetics. These all contribute to their individual differences. And these individual differences impact how they perceive stress. So for instance, somebody might be scared of might be scared of a spider. And they might have learned that from their environment, seeing their parents being scared of spiders. Or they might have learned it from a previous event where they were bitten. Or genetically, they may be more prone to trait anxiety, and so different things create anxiousness or stress in their lives. And all of these contribute to how they perceive that spider and how much of a physiological response they get and what that means for their behavioral response. So whether they take off, or they try to get someone to help them kill the spider, or they deal with the situation themselves. So here's kind of an array of stress responses, and these go from stress responses that I would like the physiological side, like higher blood pressure, rapid shallow breathing, increased heart rate, dilation of pupils, muscle tension, dry mouth. Those are some of the things that we're really dealing with here in state anxiety and in sporting performance. As I'm sure a lot of you can imagine, trying to compete with increased heart rate or muscle tension or higher blood pressure or shallow breathing is going to affect how they perform. On some of the longer term responses to stress, things like on the behavioral side, we see sleep disturbances, use of alcohol or drugs, absenteeism, and aggression. On the emotional side, we kind of see some of, in situations of high stress or performance anxiety, we see a lot of irritability. We see a lot of loss of humor, sometimes crying, and then on obviously more long-term, more trait anxiety situations, we see depression and anxiety as well as suicide. Cognitive, which is really interesting because what happens also in the stress response is that basically so much is going on with us physiologically, and we're sending messages, our body's sending messages back up to our brain saying that we're freaking out and we're stressed and we're nervous. And at some point, basically what happens is our cerebellum, kind of like our basic brain, starts to take over, and we stop using our prefrontal cortex, which is really important in decision making and really high functioning decisions. And so lack of concentration, worrying, we're not able to think that clearly when we're extremely stressed. We find that athletes have poor memory, and not just athletes in general, and we're more prone to negative thoughts. Although humans in general, we're more prone to negative thoughts regardless. I think on an average day, we have about 50 to 70,000 thoughts, and about 70 to 80% of those thoughts are negative. So just thinking that when we are stressed, our thoughts are even more negative. So we're looking at above 70%. Now, I know this wasn't one of the parts that we were mainly talking about today, but I thought it would be important just to mention it's not good on the other hand either. We don't want our athletes to be bored or disengaged or not care. Because in this type of situation, we find our brain is unable to stay focused, as I'm sure you all as coaches have noticed at one point or another with your athletes. When we're at that really low level of emotional arousal, or we have zero anxiety whatsoever, we're disengaged and we aren't able to focus on anything. So at the same time, we don't see really good performance in these situations either. So I'm sure many of you have seen this graph. And on the bottom there, it says emotional arousal, but that could be substituted with anxiety or really stress. or perceived stress. So here we see, and what we're mainly talking about here today is the right-hand side of this graph, and what happens when we get too nervous, or we have too much anxiety, or we have too much perceived stress. We have poor performance. But it's also important to note that, on the other hand, when we have zero anxiety or zero nerves or zero perceived stress, that we do see a lower performance as well. The other thing it's important to mention, because sports are so different, if you look at that red, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but in case you can, if you look at that red circle up there, we find that midpoint obviously differs per individual. So someone that works well under pressure would be more on the higher end over here, and someone that works well under relaxed or more calm situations would be over here. At the same time, we see highly physical sports like rugby, football, hockey over here, because there's a lot of almost adrenaline required for those sports. And on the other hand, we would see something like curling, bowls, sports where there isn't as much physicality to it. And much more small muscle or very technical skills required without high physicality, we would want to be over here. So the description of ideal performance state. So this is going back to right here, also known as the zone of optimal function. Many people have different words for it. So we're talking about what is right here for our athletes. And what we found, or what research has found, is to have the complete absence of fear or no fear whatsoever of failure. And going back to what the story at the beginning there with Alex Honnold, like they noticed when they ran some functional MRI scans on his brain, what they found was there was a complete absence of fear when climbing, but a total regular fear response within his brain if he was to think about having to do a presentation or to public speak. We see that athletes don't overanalyze. And when we see overanalyzing, we see lots of athletes go down the rabbit hole of what if, and that can lead to more what ifs and future-oriented or past-oriented thoughts, which have no end. We see athletes in this state have a narrow focus instead on the activity itself. So what they need to do or what they are doing. There's also a sense of effortlessness, and that's not to say that they don't feel pain. Sometimes athletes confuse that, but it's not to say that they don't feel pain. It just feels less effort than it has previously. They have a sense of personal control, which is extremely important. They don't believe that their opponents are in control of outcomes. They don't believe referees or judges are in control. They believe that they have control of their own outcome. And a distortion of time and space. So either time stands still or it goes by super quickly, but it doesn't work in the way that it normally does for someone. So how do we recognize anxiety or boredom in our athletes? So what does anxiety look like in your athletes? Or how can you tell when your athletes are out of their ideal performance state? It's very difficult to get into ideal performance state. So it's unlikely that a good percentage of your athletes will be in their complete ideal performance state all the time in competition. Um, so let me open up a bit to you guys and get you guys to contribute a little bit here. What are some of the things that you note as stressors or as anxiety in your athletes? And I can't see the, I don't have that
I can.
little, okay,
Oh, your
yeah, if you
little
don't mind,
went away?
Natasha, sorry. Yeah, I don't
No,
have
not at
the
all.
tab went away when I started
Oh,
presenting.
yeah. It's all good. We've got a couple
Sorry about
people
that.
typing. Hey, I don't mind. It's all good. I'll just start. Well, we've got multiple attendees typing, which is awesome. So um, I'll share with you guys. I know one thing in I coach mostly snowboarding, and anxiety often looks like the athletes falling. So they'll suddenly start falling on tricks that they could do previously.
Okay. And that would be in warm up?
Well, could be through the whole thing if their anxiety is pretty high. So we've
Oh, I
got.
do see some things popping up there. Okay.
Okay, can you
But
see them, or do you
it
want me to
pops up
read
and
them?
goes away, so yeah.
Okay, so Jeff
Yeah, if you
Harper.
don't mind reading them, Natasha, because they pop up and go away.
Yeah, so Jeff says team selection events, even just thinking about them months in advance. Practice versus
Mhm.
performing in front of people is what Brianna said.
Okay.
We've got a couple other typing. Body language, hands look confused. That's an interesting. So that was from Leah. Shannon says
Okay.
making a mistake during their performance.
Hmm.
William says failure from other team members. Interesting one. These are great, you guys. Um, Marge says stomping on or off the field, and that's from a softball coach. Yeah, that one's definitely easy to pick up on. Austin says constant fidgeting, loss of coordination, overly apologetic.
Okay. Interesting. Overly apologetic.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's all the ones that we're
Yeah.
typing right there. A couple others coming in slowly. Oh, one more. We've got Andrew says missing simple shots followed by terrible body language. Yeah, similar to the stomping.
Yeah, and it's funny because um, it is quite easy, or not quite easy to see. You can tell um, anxiety levels based on the actual performance, because you as a coach know what they are capable of and know what they do on a regular day-to-day basis in training. So when they're in performance and they're doing things that they don't normally do in practice, you know that that has to do with the nerves, because from day to day, the only thing that's really changing, unless we're dealing with some kind of injury, um, is the mental side. So we know we have to really attribute those differences to something that's going on the mental end of things. And usually that has to do with anxiety when we're talking about competition situations. So we definitely can, as coaches, and I should mention I do have quite a bit of coaching background, and I came before getting into sports psychology. I came from coaching at a high level and coaching abroad for several years as well. And it was something that I was very interested in as an athlete and as a coach. And you could definitely see, I've seen myself, just the jitters right before athletes go on to perform. I've seen people get sick. So these are all things that we know they've gone into kind of the red. So if you think about a gauge of like green, yellow, and then red. What people have described so far are signs that they're in the red. So what we want to try to do is try to at least catch them in the yellow, um, and if possible, try to keep them in the green, if that works for them. Sometimes athletes work best in the yellow in performance situations. So yeah, remembering each athlete is different. So it is kind of a difficult task to ask you all to do, because it's trying to understand the stressors of each athlete, which are going to most likely be different from the next athlete. And it's important, and trying to figure out what kind of reaction that means to them and how strong of a reaction that is. So it's a lot of information. One way is to sit down with athletes at the beginning of the season, or even present them with a stressful task and ask them and have a conversation around, how did you feel? What were some of those thoughts that were going through your head? The other way of doing it would be to take notes. So in competition, starting to see patterns when my athlete starts to fall on a couple things in practice right before, perhaps on a practice run before they go right into competition. If they fall, they typically fall when they compete. On the other hand, there might be someone that typically falls in their practice run, but then is able to use that to have a perfect performance afterwards. So starting to kind of see what the performance outcomes are looking like and what you noticed about that athlete beforehand. But once again, this is quite a large task, and sometimes when you just ask your athletes, they don't know. They can't tell you what was going on in their head, or they don't really know what their major fear is. They might think it is performance or high pressure situations, but it might be something as specific as, I don't want to let my coach down, or I don't want to let my parents down. So sometimes it's hard for them to verbalize or to even have that awareness of what it actually is. Other times they might be embarrassed to tell a coach what it is. So sometimes both, or sometimes asking is difficult, and difficult to get a really valid or accurate reading. And same thing with taking notes, because we can't see what is going on in people's heads. We don't have a log of the thoughts that are going on. It would be great if we did, make my job a lot easier. We can't always, our notes might not be accurate either. So although these are really simple ways to at least start or to get a bit of an idea, they're not always the most accurate. So next thing would be, what induces the anxiety in your athletes? Expectations, I think, would be the number one thing I deal with athletes. Their expectations, dealing with what they perceive their coach's expectations or their parents' expectations. So all of those things are contributing stressors to these athletes. But one of the questions, and something to think about, is how you as a coach might possibly contribute. And that's not to say that you're doing anything wrong. I know for myself as a coach, I induced stress with some athletes just by being beside them before they went to go perform or went to go compete, whereas others needed to be close by because they found that to help them relax. So once again, this doesn't mean anything about you or your coaching ability, but it's to bring awareness to, how do I impact as a coach different athletes, even just by my presence? but more also about what I'm saying. What things should I kind of avoid saying to certain athletes beforehand? Um, and kind of getting an idea of what stressors, also beyond just yourself, that you've noticed or you see a pattern in with your athletes. And I'm just going to open it up again really quickly to the group, to share what they know as their stressors for their athletes. So Natasha, would you mind just
You
um,
bet. I'm ready to read.
reading it?
Okay, so Kelly
Raised
says a
voice.
raised voice. Yeah. We have a couple others type in, so you guys gotta type away. So the major stressors,
School.
Leah says school, yeah, workload from combined practice and class time, and Leah is a university coach. So that makes a whole lot of
Okay.
sense. James says they worry about making a mistake that lets the team down.
Mm-hmm.
Cecil says officiating. Yeah, that one can be frustrating.
Yeah, big
Um,
one.
yeah, Jen says pressure from parents or peers.
Mm-hmm.
Pressure from their parents, another one. Yeah. Expectation, Austin says expectation, skill of other teams' players, bad officials, and the audience. And Andrew again says pressure from parents. Leah, their own pressure from a previous performance. Shannon says finances, not enough money. And actually, that's a big one I've seen in snowboarding recently as well, Shannon. Trey says pressure from scouts.
Okay.
Renee says changes in competition schedules, running ahead or behind, misplacing equipment. Yeah, those are definitely good stressors, Renee. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
those are big ones. We have a couple others typing.
Okay.
Marge says if athletes perceive a coach as treating another athlete better than them.
Yeah, that would be a big one.
Hmm.
And I often hear that from athletes as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And Barry says pressure from teammates. Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
Okay. Yeah. And so once again, we heard a lot of expectations in those responses. Um, yeah, a lot of people dealing with university or school while trying to maintain a certain level of um, trying to, yeah, taking part in sport while trying to attain certain levels of grades in school and university. So some major stressors is with time management, managing relationships. Parents are a huge one, um, and other extended family members as well. Uh, Uncontrollables, yes, like refs, schedule changes, competition conditions. Those are your typical stressors that we see for athletes. So I think this is the last question that I let me think. Oh yeah. I believe this is the last question that I get you guys to answer um, before the end of the presentation. So what do you guys do right now in response to an anxious athlete in competition? And this might, and preferably when you notice nerves and before they've actually gone out to compete. How do you help out in that type of situation? Or what do you do to try to get them to remain calm? Music. Okay,
So Williams says, yeah, music. Austin says help them establish their routine.
good.
Yeah. Jen says, put yourself in the shoes of the athlete.
Hmm.
Multiple are typing. And I love this system actually says multiple are typing. Marge says, have them do some deep breathing to calm down. Mike
Hmm.
says, refocus by visualizing previous performances.
Hmm.
couple more typing.
Great. You guys have already talked about half the stuff I'm about to talk about, so you guys already have a lot of those
Jen,
skills.
uh, and the last couple, Jen says, remind them of what they are capable of. And Leah says, whoa, just a second, went up. Depends on the personality type. Sometimes lots of support and positive talk, sometimes a quick joke to take the edge off. And
hmm
Andrew says, for all our teams, we have a routine we go through, and I'll usually leave them to themselves just before the pregame practice. And Kayla
Okay.
says, develop situations prior to competition and run through them on the day of.
Yeah.
Awesome responses, you guys. Nice.
Yeah, really great responses. Really good tools, everyone. I don't know if
Mhm.
that's the new NCC program or life experience or experience within coaching, but those are all really good ways of dealing with an anxious athlete. So well done, and thanks for sharing. So most of you covered a lot of what I'm about to talk about. Um, I wanted to take it a step back uh, to because quite often as a mental performance consultant, not so much now, but when I first started uh, 8 years ago, I think, yeah, 2000, well, almost 10 years ago, um, I was quite often brought in to put out fires. And that's after a coach would see that their athletes would choke under pressure or would just not be performing to their capabilities in competition. And so I would be brought in usually mid-season or right before a competition to try to help or fix the situation. So it's always important to remember that mental skills are just like physical skills. And just like you wouldn't teach a kid or an athlete a new skill the day before a competition or the week before a competition, you wouldn't want to try out a mental skill in those for the first time the day before or the week before. So it's important to consider using mental skills significantly beforehand in more of a preventative way rather than just using mental skills in a remedial way to deal with anxiety or nerves right on the day of competition. So first one, how can you best help your athlete outside competition? One is improved awareness, and we'll talk more about all of these in a second. Two is create a culture within training. Three, tapering your feedback. And then four, if need be, and if you feel more comfortable with getting a mental performance consultant to come in and talk to your team. So awareness is number one. And when working with athletes or anybody, I always teach awareness as the first mental skill. We can't tackle any other mental skill if we don't have a good awareness of what is going on in our heads, what type of pressure situation works for ourselves and for our athletes in this situation. So if every one of you could just take a second now, and some of you have done this before for people that have been to some of my presentations with their athletes, I want everyone to either put down their beer, or their glass of wine, or their cup of tea for a second, and I want you to just cross your arms over your chest. And I'm guessing most of you did that without having to think about it. Now what I'd like for you to do is to cross your arms the opposite way. I'll give you a few seconds. So we find that when asked to cross your arms the opposite way, people struggle with that. It doesn't come naturally to them. What came naturally to them, they did at the beginning when asked to cross their arms. And when asked to cross your arms the opposite way, usually people go, oh, I just had to do the opposite. And I'll ask the athletes or whoever I'm speaking with, well, what the opposite of what? And the opposite of what you were doing to begin with. And so you had to go, okay, well, I had my left under my right and my right over my left, and now I have to go left under and right over. And I had to think about what I was doing. I had to gain an awareness of what I was currently doing to be able to change that. If I didn't know what I was doing at the beginning, I wouldn't be able to cross my arms the opposite way. In fact, I've seen people try to do it. If they don't look at what they were originally doing, they keep going back to what they did. So, number one skill. So, when I'm talking about awareness here, I'm also talking about awareness of your own stressors and how do you respond to stress. What are your stressors in competition? What athlete do you notice makes you more nervous? And what do you do what nerves do you emit that your athletes pick up on? And what language are you using? On the other hand, awareness of your athletes. So what are their stressors, which you guys have a great awareness of? How do they respond? And once again, I'm sure they respond all in different ways. And who has a positive or even negative effect on them? And what does their self-talk sound like? So what language are they using with themselves? So after gaining an awareness of those things, or at the same time, we also want to create a culture and practice. So incorporating breathing and meditation into training. That should be used just like any physical skill or stretching. We should be using breathing exercises or meditation on a regular basis in our practices, so that when we get them to do it in competition, it isn't doing it just to deal with anxiety at that moment, and they already have confidence in their ability to do it. Empowering athletes to take risks versus avoid mistakes. And sometimes we get in the habit of pointing out mistakes and not always giving them more of the information on how to fix it. So I know quite often that was something I struggled with at the beginning of my coaching careers. I would say, oh, you're on your face on that vertical, versus telling them to, push their heels away. And that's a very basic thing, but it can be a habitual thing as well. So making sure that we're using the proper language on the how-to, and also using positive reinforcement. And attitude for gratitude, and this is something I've seen more recently coaches doing, is incorporating time to be grateful for something. We found that gratitude improves overall physical, psychological health and increases self-esteem. And we found generally that people that are more grateful, are forced to think of the things that they're grateful for, have higher resiliency. I'm going to go a little bit faster here because I realize I'm running a bit over time. Okay, tapering feedback. So just like you taper physically for a competition, it's important to also taper the type of feedback that you're given. So 3 months before competition, we're mainly giving corrections on competence and abilities and skills, and giving about 30% feedback on confidence and giving reassurance. At 3 weeks, we see it go down to about 50-50, or go down and go up to about 50-50. And 3 days before competition, we want to really limit our feedback on mistakes and what they need to be doing, and increase a little bit more reassuring comments. And this is also due to, as stress increases, and like I had said before, our brain doesn't work as well. So some of the information it's getting, if it's new information, they're not going to be able to retain that information as well. So if you are heavily loading information regarding skills and techniques close to a competition, they're going to have a really hard time actually applying it. So even if they do need all that information, it's just going to be, it's going to go a little bit to waste. Fourth thing, some some coaches have a good repertoire of many different skills: parenting skills, teaching skills, coaching skills, friend skills, leadership skills. And so I recognize everyone wears many hats, and um, trying to be both their mental skills coach and their coach can prove to be very difficult at times. And that is why mental performance coaches and consultants exist. So if you feel overwhelmed by these things and it's a consistent issue, bring in somebody else to have even just a second voice. So in the moment, you can get your athletes to breathe. That is the best way to start getting them to calm down. Focus on the controllables, whether it be, or it should be both physical and mental. Get them to use visualization, to remember that they have done it before, and to kind of give them that confidence that they can do it. And keep information, once again, short and simple. So breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. You want them to engage their diaphragm. When they engage their diaphragm, it elicits the relaxation response. And the relaxation response is the exact opposite from the fight or flight response. So it helps to reduce the amount of adrenaline going through your system, and it allows your prefrontal cortex of your brain to start working again. You want to focus on the controllables. So by doing that breathing exercise, we can control our heart rate and our breathing. We want to focus on making sure our muscles are staying loose as much as possible. Body temperature, we want to stay warm or cool as much as possible. And neural activation also, and blood pressure being highly related to our heart rate and our breathing, and our self-talk. And our neural activation one's also related to our self-talk, and kind of bringing it just back down to breathing so that we have kind of a clearer mind in focusing on other things. So focusing once again on the controllables, going back to that pre-competition and competition plan that should be basically routine for the athletes, so something that they know so well that they don't even have to think about it. Focusing on their skills, on what they need to do, skills that they need to do to go fast, skills, what they need to do to execute a skill in general, or what they need to do to work well as a team. And basically having their best performance versus winning or beating somebody, that it's still brought back to them because they can control that. Get them to visualize. We want to do that in short segments, so one event at a time. And we want that when they're using their visualization that they're doing everything perfectly. They can do it from their own perspective or from an observer perspective, but we also want them to use visualization to practice encountering difficult circumstances and having backup plans on how to deal with those situations. So keep information short and simple. So the average human attention span is 8 seconds. So I lost you guys quite some time ago, I guess. But try to think of and I'm sure most of you heard about the sandwich technique. This one is a slight modification of that sandwich technique. I like to have athletes think about, and their coaches, ask questions about what went well, what needs to be improved, and it can be an overall positive statement, but also how to improve it. So giving them that bit of information at the very end on how to improve something. Okay, so phew, I was cutting it close there for a second. All right, so today's takeaways. Stress and anxiety can come from anywhere and affects people in different ways and to different extents. Important for you to not only consider your athletes, but to become aware of your stressors, and then to try and understand your athlete's anxiety as best you can. You can help by creating a culture in training, adjusting your feedback or tapering your feedback in competition situations, getting them to breathe. And that could just be one breath or taking 5 minutes to do a breathing exercise. Always focusing on the controllables and asking questions as a coach on what they can control and what they can do. Getting them to visualize and keeping things short and simple as far as information. And that is it. Do we have any questions?
All right. Yes, you guys type away in that box and we'll open it up for questions. We have at least one person type in, Danielle.
Great.
Yeah, and I just want to start by saying thank you. That was really great. And yeah, I think a lot of it, like it sounds like that we had some coaches online that had some of these skills, but it's such a great reminder and just to kind of bring it to the forefront again. So yeah, you're getting lots of thank yous. So if anyone has any questions, ask away, and then I will just do a quick wrap up as well before we let you guys go. I know it's very late.
Yeah.
It's extra late for some of you in Newfoundland.
Oh, right.
Yeah, they're half an hour later, so it's 10:30 there. Yeah. Okay, I'll let you guys, if you have questions. Okay, there we have one. So would it be possible to get a copy of your presentation slides?
Sure.
Danielle. Okay, so yes, we can send that out to everyone. Also, to let you guys know, so I did record this, and we do finally have our YouTube channel all set up. So we're going to have a new Canadian Sports Center Atlantic YouTube channel that'll be running very shortly. It's set up, we just haven't populated it yet. And all of our webinars that we've done this year will be posted on that. So I'm just going to